Greetings and welcome to the Understanding Plato podcast. This is Lawrence Holgate, author of the book Understanding Plato, subtitled The Smart Student's Guide to the Socratic Dialogues in the Republic. This is the first book of the Smart Student's Guides. There are 7 other books, each of them on one of the great classical books of philosophy. You can check it out going to my website, holgatebooks.com. Remember to spell Holgate with a U, Houlgate, books, plural.com. We are now in an episode that takes us to chapter 11 of Understanding Plato, the book. It has the title Defective Constitutions and Damaged Souls, and it is out of books 8 and 9 of Plato's Republic. And Socrates now returns to the task from which he had earlier been diverted. The first task in Book 8 is to both describe the various ways in which the perfect city now being an aristocracy or a kingship, as he calls it, whether that perfect city that was constructed way back in Book 4 of Republic, how it contrasts with 4 types of imperfect cities. And he wants to explain how the perfect city might devolve into one or more of the imperfect types. And the second part of this task is to show by analogy the various kinds of imperfect individuals and how it is not only possible but predictable that a perfect individual might eventually become less perfect. And finally, Plato devotes the entirety of a later book to a description of what he calls the tyrannical man, how this man evolves and why he is the most miserable and wretched of all men. So let's begin with the first part of the task, the imperfection in constitutions and in individuals. In order to describe one constitution or individual as more imperfect than or inferior to another, we must provide a standard against which each can be measured and compared as more or less perfect. Back in Book 4, the standard used by Socrates to judge a city is justice, defined in that book as each person practicing one of the pursuits in the city, the one for which he or she is naturally suited. And the same standard is used to judge an individual as just, but with the emphasis on parts of the soul and the extent to which each part does its natural job of ruling or being ruled. Depending on how a city or an individual measures up to the standard, it can be assessed as more or less just and therefore more or less perfect than other cities or individuals. The second part of the discussion, as I've already said in books 8 and 9, is to explain how a city or an individual person can become less perfect or worse than another. And as we're going to discover, Socrates argues that such changes in a city are attributed to changes in the ruling class of the city. And insofar as the guardians or the rulers become corrupted, so does the city. Now, if you look at the analogy with the city, the changes we are to see in the reasoning or the rational part of the individual soul determines its eventual corruption. Socrates attributes most of the blame for the devolution to lapses in the kind of education provided to the new generation of rulers or guardians by those who are currently ruling. Of course, these are empirical guesses about how the ruling class or any individual becomes psychologically degraded. No evidence is produced by Plato to support any of these claims, except occasional observations about how the current guardians ignore important aspects of the education of the next generation of rulers. Because the guesses of the character Socrates about these matters are no better than our guesses, I will omit discussion of these issues and leave it to you, dear reader, or dear listener, to read the relevant passages and make your own determination about what child-rearing strategies we should adopt and which to avoid in order to successfully raise aristocratic rulers of the ideal city. Let's look at the kind of cities that, or states, or governing models that Plato talks about. The first of these is timocracy. And a timocracy or a timocratic city is one in which the rulers are, quote, victory-loving and honor-loving. These are men who are, quote, more naturally suited for war than peace. And it's honoring the tricks and stratagems of war and spending all the time making war. These timocrats also have an appetite for money, although they keep this secret, and they no longer live in austere barracks with other guardians, but they have, quote, real private nests in which they can spend lavishly on their women or on anyone else they please. It would seem that the timocratic rulers are more focused on making themselves happy by satisfying their selfish desires for victory, honor, and money than they are in making the whole city happy. I'm reading from paragraphs 547 to 548 in Republic. Now, compare that to a timocratic man. We've just described the timocratic city, or the timocratic state. How does that compare to a timocratic man? Well, here's what Plato, through Socrates, says. A timocratic man, by comparison, is, quote, a lover of ruling and of honor, who does not base his claim to rule on his ability to speak or anything like that, but on his exploits in war and anything having to do with war. He's a lover of physical training and of hunting. Paragraph 549a in Republic. The value that he most desires is honor, victory, and a good reputation, in stark contrast to the dominant desire of the person with an aristocratic soul who just wants knowledge and truth. Now, let's take a look at oligarchy. This is the next of the various types of government that Socrates talks about. An oligarchy, or oligarchic city, is defined by Socrates as a city based on property assessment, the one in which the rich rule and the poor man does not participate in ruling at all. The oligarchs pass a law, quote, establishing a wealth qualification, higher where it is more oligarchic, lower where it is less so, and they proclaim that anyone whose property does not reach the stated assessment cannot participate in ruling. Paragraph 551b. Socrates, by the way, the word oligarchy, I'm sure you've heard it before. It's used quite loosely in United States political campaigns. The charge that the United States of America is or is becoming an oligarchy because of the widening gap between rich and poor does not imply that wealth is a qualification for political office. It usually means that the wealthy can use substantial sums to influence an election, as they do, including their own election if they choose to stand for office, and as a result, they get more access to those they help to get elected. However, the United States does have a history of some states requiring property ownership for voting in a general election. Most of these voting requirements lasted until at least the Jacksonian era, so there was a history of that in the United States. But by the time of Jackson as president, the Jacksonian era, most of those voting requirements were discarded. So there's little or no comparison between what we call oligarchy today and what Plato was talking about, where you actually had to have a very large property assessment in order to run at all. And not in order to run, but just to be a ruler. Socrates points out that the most serious defect of an oligarchy is that an oligarch is no more qualified to rule the city than he is qualified to be a ship captain. He is as likely to make the city better than to sail the ship without sinking it. And his second, oligarchic rule splits the city in two, he says. You've got a city of the poor and the rich living in the same place and always plotting against one another. The inevitable effect of this is not only an increase in beggars, but a higher rate of thievery in the city, all of it traced to the poverty of most of the populace. Now, by the way, that is something that he predicted when you get a wide gap, a wide wealth gap between people in a country, and as in the United States, where there is a wide wealth gap between the billionaires and the rest of us, that you're going to see a rise in thievery, in crime, and in beggars, homeless people. Now, okay, that was a little bit of taking us off the track, but I'm going to go on now, because the whole point here is Plato's whole point was to describe an analogy between the oligarchic state and now the oligarchic man. By comparison, the oligarchic man is one who will establish the appetitive and money-making element on the throne of his own soul and make it a great king within himself. And he makes the rational element and the spirited element sit on the ground beneath it, one on either side, and be slaves. Okay, now if you think about this now, he's making this analogy between the oligarchic city and the oligarchic man, and the oligarchic city is one that is ruled by the rich, by the wealthy, and he thinks that the analogy, or Plato says that the analogy here would be to what it is that rules you. If you are ruled by your appetites, then you are a lot like the ruler who rules in the city based on his desire to, or his having wealth. So not only does the oligarchic man not desire knowledge and truth, neither does he desire honor, victory, and a good reputation. He's not like the timocratic guy. The oligarchic man is completely ruled by the appetitive desires, by food, drink, sex, and the money with which to acquire these things. So that's where he's going with the model of the oligarch. Now, democracy. Things are getting worse, folks, and democracy is at the bottom, or next to the bottom. Socrates says that a democracy or a democratic city is one in which the city is, quote, full of freedom and freedom of speech, and there is license in it to do whatever one wants, including license for each person to arrange his own life in whatever way pleases him. Paragraph 557b, Republic. The other features of a democracy are no compulsion to rule or to be ruled, to be at war when others are at war, to keep the peace with others who are keeping it, and if there is a law preventing you from ruling or serving on a jury, you have no obligation to obey this law. Condemn criminals, walk around free in the city in a democracy. And finally, the constitution of a democracy assigns a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike, implying the exact opposite of the aristocratic or the just city's adherence to the principle of natural division of labor. Even if two people are unequal with respect to the natural ability to rule, citizens living in a democracy who fail to have this ability, that is, they have no clue about how to rule, they are not to be excluded from the ruling class. That, he says, is one of the great dangers of democracy, that people who are not prepared to rule, who do not have this natural ability, who have no good education, they are to be excluded from the ruling class. And the first thing to observe about this description of democracy is that it appears to be more like anarchy than what we in the 21st century would refer to as democracy. We don't use the word democracy to refer to a state of lawlessness or political disorder due to the absence of governmental authority, having no mandatory laws or failing to enforce the laws that we do have. Democracy for us is representative, meaning that the laws are created either by a majority vote or by elected representatives in an elected legislative body. And we also understand that there are constitutional restraints on what laws can be validly enacted by the majority or by their representatives. For example, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that would be a kind of break on, that's what we call a constitutional democracy, where we put limits on what the majority can do. So even if we have a majority vote establishing, let's say, Catholicism as the religion of the state, that would be prohibited. It is true that there is a license or a right to arrange our own lives in the important sense that we're not required to do those jobs that are dictated by our natural talents. At the same time, this freedom is restricted by laws prohibiting actions that cause or threaten to cause harm to others. And condemned criminals are not, quote, free to walk around in the city, unless they are out on bail while waiting for a decision on an appeal of their conviction. So that's another way in which Plato's idea of democracy is that, well, you can break any rule you want, and you can harm others without fear of being jailed. That's not our democracy. Now, what's the analogy? How does he close this out? Well, Socrates begins his discussion of the private individual who resembles the democratic city with a distinction between necessary and unnecessary appetites. Necessary and unnecessary appetites. Necessary appetites are, quote, those we cannot deny. For example, the desire to eat to the point of health and well-being. The unnecessary appetites are those that go beyond these and seek other sorts of foods. They are appetites that people can hold in check. And often they are harmful to the body or harmful to the soul's capacity for wisdom and temperance, 559a. Socrates adds to this the observation that the necessary but not the unnecessary appetites are money-making because they are useful where work is connected. The individual with a democratic soul puts all of his appetites on an equal footing. There, by the way, is your analogy to the democratic state, where everyone is equal. The person with the democratic soul surrenders rule over himself to whichever desire comes along, as if it were chosen by lot, until it is satisfied. And after that, to another desire, dishonoring none, but satisfying all equally. If he is told that it is better to satisfy some appetites and put others aside, he denies all this and declares that they are all alike and must be honored on an equal basis. And so he lives from day to day, this democratic person with a democratic soul. He gratifies the appetite of the moment. Sometimes he drinks heavily while listening to the flute, while at others he drinks only water and is on a diet. Sometimes he goes in for physical training, while there are other times when he is idle and neglects everything. Sometimes he spends his time engaged in what he takes to be philosophy. Often, though, he takes part in politics, leaping to his feet and saying and doing whatever happens to come into his mind. If he admires some military men, that is the direction in which he is carried. If some moneymakers, then in that different one. There is neither order nor necessity in his life. Yet he, the democratic man, with a democratic soul, he calls it pleasant, free, and blessedly happy, and he follows it throughout his life. Just go with whatever desire you have, whether it's a necessary desire or an unnecessary one, a necessary appetite or an unnecessary one. And it's important to see that the democratic individual makes his own decisions. He listens to those who tell him to satisfy only the necessary appetites and put aside the others, but he's free to choose not to do this. He knows what he is doing. Unlike the non-rational behavior of a small child, the choices made by the democratic person are calculated, and he enjoys the carefree life he has chosen. The difference between him and the aristocratic man is not that he lacks an operative, rational part of his soul, nor that he is forced to make his choices by out-of-control unnecessary appetites, but that he falsely believes that by giving in to whatever desires come along, he will be happier than he would be if he resists this kind of life. That is the democratic man. Well, we're going to break this off now. We're getting to what is the worst part, the worst state, and the worst, most damaged soul, called tyranny. And we'll go with that in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and see you soon. Bye-bye.